My daughter. Secretly sold my house and put me in a nursing home. That's where you belong. I nodded and made one phone call. The next morning, she came to me, trembling and in tears. In her hands, she was holding, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I knew my daughter. That sounds like such a simple thing to say, doesn't it? Every mother thinks she knows her child. I changed her diapers. I held her hand through chickenpox and heartbreak and the death of her father. I sat in the front row at her college graduation with a bouquet of yellow roses because those were her favorites, and I cried so hard the woman beside me offered me a tissue and a cough drop. I thought I knew Carol the way I knew the layout of my own home. Every corner, every creak in the floorboard, every place where the light fell just right in the late afternoon. That home was a white colonial on Birchwood Lane in Hendersonville, North Carolina. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a magnolia tree in the backyard that my late husband, George, planted the year we were married. 41 years I lived in that house. I raised Carol there. I buried George from that front porch, watching the hearse pull away between the oak trees while neighbors stood on their lawns with their hands over their hearts. That house was not just property. It was the architecture of my entire life. I am Dorothy Marsh. I was 74 years old when all of this happened, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I was not a frail woman. I gardened. I drove myself to the grocery store. I did the crossword puzzle every morning in ink. My doctor called me annoyingly healthy at my last checkup, and I took that as the highest compliment a woman my age could receive. Carol was 51. She lived 20 minutes away in Asheville with her husband, Dennis, a man I had never fully trusted, though for years I told myself that was simply the prejudice of a mother who believed no one was quite good enough for her child. Dennis sold insurance and wore cologne that arrived in a room before he did. He had small eyes and a large handshake, the kind of man who was always performing confidence rather than possessing it. Carol had been quieter since she married him, smaller somehow. The warning signs began about 8 months before everything collapsed. Small things at first. Carol started coming by the house more often than usual. Not for visits exactly, but for what I can only describe as inspections. She would walk through the rooms with a particular look on her face, a measuring kind of look. And she would ask questions that seemed casual but had a strange weight to them. "Mom, do you ever think about downsizing? This yard is a lot for one person to manage, isn't it? Have you thought about what you want to do with the house, eventually?" I thought she was worried about me. A widow alone in a big house. It was a reasonable concern for a daughter to have. I told her I was fine. I told her I had my garden club, my neighbor Ruth, my Tuesday lunches with the ladies from church. She smiled and nodded, and I noticed, but did not fully register, that her eyes did not quite match her smile. Then there were the documents. Small requests, framed as practicalities. She brought over a new power of attorney form about 6 months before everything happened, explaining that the old one, the one I had signed years ago giving George authority, then updated to include Carol, was outdated. She sat at my kitchen table and walked me through it with the smooth, practiced patience of someone who had rehearsed the conversation. I signed. Why wouldn't I? She was my daughter. I noticed, 2 months later, that some mail had stopped arriving. Bills I usually received by paper now seemed to be going somewhere else. When I asked Carol about it, she said she had simply set up online management to make things easier. I was not entirely comfortable with this, but I was also not entirely suspicious. Not yet. The last Tuesday in March, Carol and Dennis came together. That was unusual. Dennis almost never came to the house. He stood in my living room with his hands in his pockets, rocking slightly on his heels, while Carol sat beside me on the sofa and took my hand. I remember thinking how cold her fingers were. She told me they had been talking, she and Dennis, and they were worried. They thought it was time for me to be somewhere safe. She used that phrase 3 times. Somewhere safe. She told me she had already found a wonderful place, Sunrise Gardens, a senior living facility on the edge of town, and she had taken the liberty of arranging a room. I looked at her. "And the house?" I asked. There was a pause. Not long, but I noticed it. "We'll take care of the house, Mom," she said. "Don't worry about the house." I nodded slowly. I smiled. I told her I needed to think about it. She looked relieved, and that relief told me something she hadn't intended to reveal. She had expected resistance, and my calmness had disarmed her. That night, after they left, I sat in George's old armchair by the window and looked out at the magnolia tree, silver in the moonlight. What exactly, I thought, had she already arranged? I reached for my phone. I did not sleep that night. I sat in that armchair until the sky outside began to lighten from black to gray to the pale, reluctant blue of early morning, and I thought. My mind, which people sometimes assumed was softening with age, was in fact doing what it had always done best. It was organizing, sorting, laying facts in a row like tiles, and examining the pattern they made. The facts, as I understood them, were these. Carol had a power of attorney. She had taken over management of my financial mail. She had, by her own admission, already arranged a room for me at a senior care facility, a decision she had made without my consent or even my knowledge. And when I had asked about the house, she had deflected. I was a practical woman. George had seen to that. He was an estate attorney for 30 years, and he had spent much of our married life gently educating me in the mechanics of property and law, not because he thought I needed protection, but because he believed everyone should understand the world they lived in. I knew what a power of attorney could do in the wrong hands. I knew what "we'll take care of the house" could mean. Could Carol have? No. I stopped myself. I would not run to conclusions, but I would find out. The first fear hit me around 5 in the morning, a wave of it, genuine and cold. Not the abstract anxiety of the previous weeks, but something specific and physical. The fear that I had already lost something I couldn't get back, that the documents had already been signed somewhere without my knowledge, that the magnolia tree and the wraparound porch and the room where George died already belonged to someone else. I let the fear sit with me for exactly 10 minutes. I had learned over 74 years that fear was not an enemy. It was information. It told you what mattered. And then, when you had listened to it, you set it aside, and you moved. By 6 o'clock, I had a plan. The first thing I needed to know was the true status of my house. In North Carolina, property records are public. Deed transfers are recorded with the County Register of Deeds and are accessible online and in person. If Carol had sold my house, if it had been sold at all, there would be a record. I was not able to search the online database myself with full confidence, but I knew someone who could. My neighbor, Ruth Calloway, was 68, retired from 30 years as a paralegal, and possessed of a deeply satisfying skepticism about human nature that I had always admired. She was also, crucially, one of the few people in my life who had never liked Dennis. She had told me so once, 5 years ago, at a neighborhood barbecue, leaning close and saying quietly, "Dorothy, that man's eyes are too still. Watch him." I had laughed it off at the time. I was not laughing now. I called Ruth at 7. She picked up on the second ring because Ruth always picked up on the second ring. "Ruth," I said, "I need your help with something. I think something may be very wrong." She was at my door in 11 minutes. She still wore her reading glasses on top of her head from where she'd been working on something when I called, and she had a yellow legal pad under her arm, as though she had known instinctively that notes would need to be taken. I told her everything, sitting at my kitchen table over coffee. I told her about the documents, the redirected mail, Carol's visit, the phrase, "We'll take care of the house." Ruth listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about her. She let me finish completely before she spoke. "All right," she said, opening the legal pad. "First thing, we checked the Register of Deeds. Henderson County, all property transfers are online. If anything has been recorded against your address, we'll see it." She paused. "Do you still have the deed to this house?" I went to the fireproof lockbox I kept in the bedroom closet. George had been adamant about the lockbox, and I retrieved what I had. The original deed, the title, insurance policy, my will, my financial account statements, the paper copies I had always insisted on keeping, despite Carol's push toward going digital. Ruth laid them out on the table like a hand of cards. She looked at them carefully, then looked at me. "Your financial accounts," she said slowly. "These statements are from 8 months ago. Do you have anything more recent?" I did not, because Carol had been managing the mail. A cold, specific clarity settled over me then. I understood in that moment that what I was facing was not a misunderstanding. It was not a daughter being overzealous about her mother's welfare. It was a scheme, patient and deliberate, that had been constructed around me while I sat in my house growing my tomatoes and doing my crossword puzzles, trustingly, completely blind. "Ruth," I said, "I need to know the full extent of what's been done, and then I need to make a phone call." "Who are you calling?" she asked. I folded my hands on the table. "The one person in this situation who isn't family," I said. "My attorney." Ruth looked at me with an expression that was equal parts admiration and concern. Then she picked up her pen. "Then let's find out what we're dealing with first," she said. "So, you walk into that office knowing exactly where you stand." We spent the rest of the morning building my case, and the picture that emerged was worse than I had feared. And, it turned out, not yet complete. My attorney was a woman named Patricia Holt. I had used Pat Holt for 15 years, since George retired, and we needed someone to update our estate documents. She was in her mid-50s, a precise and unhurried woman who wore her gray hair in a smooth chignon and had a manner that made you feel, in her presence, that the law was not an abstraction, but a set of very concrete tools that could be picked up and used. George had respected her enormously, which was not something he granted easily. Ruth drove me to Pat's office the following morning. I had called ahead, explained that it was urgent, and Pat had rearranged her schedule without asking for details over the phone, which told me she understood the nature of urgency. I sat across from her desk with the documents Ruth and I had gathered, and I told her what I knew. Pat listened with her hands folded on the desk, perfectly still, the way a doctor listens when they are already forming a diagnosis. When I finished, she asked to see the power of attorney I had signed 6 months ago. I slid it across the desk. She read it slowly, and as she read, something in her face changed. Not dramatically, but I was watching for it. "Dorothy," she said, setting the document down, "this is a general durable power of attorney. Broad authority. It includes real property transactions." She paused. "Who drafted this document?" I had assumed a notary, or someone Pat would recognize. "I don't know," I said. "Carol brought it. She said it was updated, Pat's expression remained composed, but her eyes were not. "This was not drafted by our office," she said. "I want to be very clear about that. The language here is, it gives your daughter the authority to sell, transfer, and encumber real property on your behalf, without your presence at closing." The room was very quiet. Outside Pat's window, I could hear traffic on the street below, ordinary and indifferent. "Can she have already used it?" I asked. "Let's find out," Pat said, and turned to her computer. She pulled up the Henderson County Register of Deeds online database. She typed in my address on Birchwood Lane. And there it was. A deed of conveyance, recorded 11 days ago. My home. The white colonial, the magnolia tree, 41 years. Transferred from Dorothy Louise Marsh to a name I did not recognize. An LLC. 3 words, clean and anonymous. Birchwood Properties, LLC. I looked at the screen. I did not cry. I had cried all the previous night, and I had no more of it available. "Who is Birchwood Properties, LLC?" Ruth asked from her chair against the wall. "That," said Pat, "is what we are going to find out. And I will tell you what I suspect we will find." She looked at me directly. "North Carolina Secretary of State records are also public. LLC registrations, officer names, registered agents. If your daughter or her husband are connected to this entity, we will see it." She opened another browser tab. She searched. She found Birchwood Properties, LLC, registered 6 weeks ago. Registered agent, Dennis Allen Fairchild. Dennis. Carol's husband. His full name there on the state's public record. Attached to an LLC that had purchased my home 11 days ago using a power of attorney that his wife had obtained from me 6 months earlier, through a document I had signed at my own kitchen table while she held my hand. The room held that information for a moment. "Patricia," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice was. "What are my options?" She leaned back slightly. "Several. A power of attorney can be challenged on grounds of undue influence, fraud, or lack of informed consent. A deed transfer can potentially be voided if it was executed fraudulently. You would need to demonstrate that you did not understand the scope of what you signed, or that the document was obtained through deception." She paused. "The fact that the POA was not drafted by your regular attorney, that it was brought to you by the direct beneficiary, that it was used to transfer property to an LLC controlled by that beneficiary's spouse. These are not favorable facts for your daughter." "How long would this take?" Ruth asked. "Property fraud litigation can take time. Months, certainly, possibly longer." Pat looked at me. "However, there are immediate steps available. We can file an emergency motion to cloud the title. That prevents any further transfer or financing of the property while the matter is in dispute. We can file a complaint with the North Carolina State Bar if a licensed attorney assisted in this, and with the county sheriff's office for elder financial exploitation, which is a criminal matter in this state." She folded her hands. "Dorothy, what happened to you has a name. It is elder financial abuse, and North Carolina takes it seriously." I nodded. I felt something crystallize in my chest. Not anger, exactly, though anger was there. Something harder. Cleaner. "File the motion," I said, "and open a complaint with the sheriff's office, today." Pat nodded and reached for her phone. I was aware, even as she dialed, that Carol did not yet know I had done this. She thought I was at Sunrise Gardens, settling into my room, grateful for my daughter's consideration, nodding along pleasantly. But she would find out. And when she did, I thought, she would come. I intended to be ready. The motion to cloud the title was filed by end of business that same day. Pat explained it to me carefully before I left her office. A Ellis pendens, a formal legal notice recorded against the property, indicating that ownership was under dispute. It would appear in the property records. It would prevent Birchwood Properties, LLC, from selling, refinancing, or borrowing against the house until the matter was resolved. It was not a judgment. It was not a victory. But it was a lock on the door. The sheriff's office was next. Ruth drove me there directly from Pat's office, and I filed a complaint for elder financial exploitation, which in North Carolina carries criminal penalties, including felony charges, when the value of assets exceeds a certain threshold. My home was worth $430,000. The threshold was $10,000. A deputy took my statement at a desk that smelled of coffee and old paper, and he looked at the documents I brought with the careful, expressionless attention of someone who was seeing something he had seen before, and found it no less troubling for the familiarity. "Ma'am," he said when I finished, "do you have somewhere safe to stay?" "I am staying at Sunrise Gardens currently," I said, with only the slightest effort to keep my voice even. "My daughter arranged it." He wrote something in his notes. I was back at Sunrise Gardens by 4 that afternoon. It was not a terrible place, I should say. The staff were kind. The food was adequate. The room was clean. But it smelled of industrial cleaner and something underneath it, something I could not name, and the view from my window was a parking lot. 41 years of looking out at a magnolia tree. Now I had a parking lot. Carol called the next morning. I let it ring 3 times. Then I answered, "Mom, how are you settling in? I was going to come by this weekend." "Carol," I said pleasantly, "how was your evening?" A pause. Brief. "Fine. Good. Mom, are you okay? You sound—" "I'm perfectly well," I said. "I thought you should know that I visited my attorney yesterday." The silence that followed was not brief. "You— What? Why? Mom, you don't need—" "It was routine," I said. "Patricia just wanted to review some documents. You know how she is. Very thorough." Another pause, longer. I could hear Carol breathing. I could hear, beneath that, the quality of her silence, the sound of someone recalculating. "Of course," she said finally. "That's fine. That's totally fine, Mom." She got off the phone in under 2 minutes. 12 minutes later, my cell phone rang again. It was Dennis. I did not answer. He called 3 more times over the next hour. Then he stopped. They came that evening, both of them. They arrived at Sunrise Gardens at 6:15 and asked to see me at the front desk. And the aide knocked on my door and told me my daughter and son-in-law were in the common room. I put on my cardigan, George's favorite, the blue one, and went to meet them. Dennis stood up when I entered. He was smiling, but it was the smile of a man who is deciding in real time how afraid to be. Carol sat beside him, and I saw immediately that she had been crying recently and had tried to conceal it. "Mom," Dennis said, spreading his hands in a gesture of openness, "we just want to talk. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." "What misunderstanding is that?" I asked, sitting down. "Your attorney. We heard you went to see an attorney, and we just want to make sure you have all the information because, Mom, we did everything we did out of love, and we don't want lawyers getting involved and making this into something it isn't." "Dennis," I said. He stopped. "I know about Birchwood Properties, LLC," I said. "I know your name is on the registration. I know my home was transferred to that entity 11 days ago using a power of attorney that was drafted specifically to enable that transaction." I looked at Carol. "I know you brought that document to my kitchen table and had me sign it." Carol's face went white. Completely. In 30 years, I had never seen my daughter's face go that color. "Mom," she said, "it's not what it looks like." "There is a lis pendens on the property," I said. "The title is clouded. You will not be able to do anything further with that house until a court resolves the matter. Additionally, a complaint has been filed with the Henderson County Sheriff's Office for elder financial exploitation. I paused. That is a felony in this state. Dennis stood up. The pretense of openness was gone. His face had shifted to something I had suspected was always underneath it. You want to play it that way? He said. You'll lose everything in legal fees. We will fight this. You don't have the money for a long litigation. Sit down, Dennis, I said. He did not sit down. We could make this very uncomfortable for you, he said. We could claim you weren't mentally competent when you agreed to move here. We could say you've been confused. Who are people going to believe? A woman your age, alone, or... I said sit down, I said again, in exactly the same tone. He sat down. I stood up. I will be speaking with my attorney again on Monday, I said. Until then, I would ask you not to contact me. If you do, those communications will be documented. I looked at Carol one more time. She was not white anymore. She was looking at the floor. I raised you better than this, I said, and I walked back to my room. I did not slam the door. I closed it very quietly. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and I let my hands shake because they wanted to, and there was no one there to see. That weekend, I slept. I let Ruth bring me food from the diner she liked. I watched old films on the small television in my room. I let myself be 74 years old and tired and not required to be formidable for 2 consecutive days. And then, on Monday morning, I got up and put on my blue cardigan and called Pat. The first temptation came on a Wednesday. A card arrived at Sunrise Gardens, slipped under my door rather than given to me by the front desk, which told me whoever delivered it had not come through the main entrance. The envelope had no return address. Inside was a single note card, Carol's handwriting. I would know it anywhere. The particular loop of her lowercase g's, the way she always underlined her signature. Mom, I know I've hurt you. I know I have no right to ask anything. But can we please talk before this goes any further? I love you. Just us. No lawyers. No Dennis. Please. See, I read it twice. I set it on the desk. I did not throw it away because Pat had told me to keep everything. Did I feel the pull of it? Of course I did. She was my daughter. I had held her when she had nightmares. I had sat with her in the hospital after her miscarriage, the one she didn't talk about, and I had not talked about it either, but I had simply stayed, because sometimes that is the only thing there is. The word love in her handwriting cost me something to look at, but I also knew what I knew. The L.S. Pendens was on the property. The sheriff's office had opened a formal investigation. Pat had filed a motion to challenge the power of attorney on grounds of fraud and undue influence, and she had told me that in the 3 weeks since the transfer, Birchwood Properties, LLC, had not yet relisted or refinanced the house. The cloud on the title had stopped them cold. They were trapped, and they knew it. And the card under my door was not love. It was strategy. I put the card in the folder I was keeping for Pat, and I went to breakfast. Ruth came to see me that Thursday. She brought lemon pound cake from the bakery on 5th Street and an expression on her face that was carefully cheerful in the way of a person who has heard upsetting news and is deciding how much of it to share. She sat across from me at the small table by my window, the parking lot behind her, and we ate cake, and she told me about her garden and her son's new job, and then she stopped pretending. People are talking, she said, on Birchwood Lane, about the house. What are they saying? A realtor came through last week, took photographs. Tiffany Pruett. She lives 4 houses down. She saw and asked the realtor directly who the seller was, and the realtor said it was a corporate entity. Ruth folded her hands. Tiffany told me. She's known you for 20 years, Dorothy. She was upset. Ruth met my eyes. People want to help. This was not something I had anticipated or asked for, and the fact that it was happening without my orchestration moved me in a way the card from Carol had not. These were ordinary people on an ordinary street who had watched me garden and wave from my porch and bring soup when someone was sick, and they had seen a stranger with a camera in my yard and understood intuitively that something was wrong. What kind of help? I asked carefully. Character witnesses, Ruth said. If it goes to a hearing on your mental competence, which Dennis threatened, they will speak. Tiffany, the Hendersons, Pastor Mills. She paused. Also, and I want you to know this came entirely from her, Margaret Cho from your garden club. Her nephew is a civil attorney in Charlotte. He called Pat's office on Monday. I looked at the piece of lemon cake on my plate. I had lived in this town for 41 years, and somehow I was still surprised by it. I didn't ask anyone to do that, I said. No, Ruth agreed. But you have lived here for 4 decades and behaved decently toward people, and it turns out that matters. She picked up her fork. Carol chose the wrong woman to underestimate. Those words stayed with me. In the days that followed, I observed that Carol and Dennis had pulled back. No more calls, no more cards under the door. I learned through Pat that Birchwood Properties, LLC, had made one inquiry through their own attorney about the L.S. Pendens process, specifically how long it might remain in place. And Pat had responded with the full list of causes of action we intended to pursue. She told me their attorney's tone afterward was notably less confident. They were watching, waiting, trying to understand how much I actually had. I used the quiet to prepare. I met with Pat twice that week. Margaret's nephew, a compact, meticulous man named Daniel Cho, had agreed to consult pro bono on the civil case, which was a generosity I accepted without false pride, because pride at this point would have been self-indulgent. Pat and Daniel worked together on what was becoming a surprisingly robust case: the fraudulent power of attorney, the LLC registration predating the POA by only 2 weeks, which suggested premeditation, the financial account access Carol had assumed, which Pat's forensic review had found, included 2 electronic fund transfers out of my savings account, totaling $18,000. $18,000, money that had simply moved. While I was planting tomatoes, I was not a woman who cried easily. But I sat with that number for a while, and then I filed the additional complaint for theft. I was building something. It was slow and careful, and I was doing it from a room that smelled of industrial cleaner with a parking lot view. But I was building it, and I was not alone. They came on a Sunday. I do not think the choice of day was accidental. Sunday felt softer. Sunday implied family. Sunday was the day people were supposed to forgive each other and sit around tables and pretend that love was simple. Carol came alone this time. No Dennis. That was also deliberate, I understood immediately, because Dennis's presence the last time had not served their purposes. He was too openly hostile, too careless about showing what lived under his surface. Carol, by contrast, had always been better at performing. She looked diminished when she sat down across from me in the common room, thinner, pale in a way that wasn't makeup or artifice. Her hands, when she set them on the table, were bare, no rings. I noticed that and filed it without comment. "Mom," she said, and her voice was soft. Not practiced soft, genuinely strained. "I can't sleep. I can't eat. I know what I did was wrong. I know it." I said nothing. "I told myself it was for you," she continued. "I told myself you weren't safe alone, that the house was too much, that you'd be better somewhere with people around you, and—" She stopped. "And some of that was true. I did worry about you, But I let Dennis convince me that if we did it the way we did, we could make sure you were taken care of and still. She stopped again. We had debts. Big ones. Dennis made some investments that. How much? I asked. She looked up. What? How much debt? She swallowed. A little over 200,000. I looked at her. My daughter. The woman I had rocked to sleep in a house that was now titled in her husband's LLC. The person who had sat at my kitchen table and handed me a document and said, "Trust me." You needed the house to cover your husband's debts, I said quietly. Mom, I was desperate. And the 18,000 from my savings account? Her face changed. Something flickered through it that was not quite guilt. Something more defensive. That was to cover some immediate. Carol, stop. I kept my voice level. Don't tell me about your debts. Don't tell me about Dennis's investments. Don't sit across from me in this room and explain what you needed. I know what I lost. I know exactly what you took. I have documentation. I folded my hands on the table. Is there something specific you came here to say? She was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to fix this, Mom. I want to undo it. If you'll just drop the legal. No, Mom. No, Carol. The legal process will continue. I watched her. The criminal complaint will continue. The civil action will continue. If there is wrongdoing here, and there is, it will be addressed through the proper channels. Her face shifted again. The softness remained, but beneath it, something harder appeared. This was the moment she became something other than my penitent daughter. This was the moment the mask, as Ruth would have said, showed its edges. You're going to destroy our lives, she said, and her voice was no longer quite so gentle. Dennis could face charges. We could lose everything. Is that what you want? To see your daughter lose everything? You asked me to stop a legal process that I did not start, I said. You started it when you transferred my home to your husband's LLC. You started it $18,000 ago. I held her gaze. What I want is irrelevant. What the law requires is not. You're being rigid. Her voice rose slightly. You're being unforgiving and cold, and you're hiding behind the law because you're angry and you want to punish us. This conversation is over, Carol. Mom, it's over, I said again and stood up. She stood too, and for a moment we were both standing across that table in the common room of Sunrise Gardens. And an aide glanced over from the far side of the room and looked away again. The professional discretion of someone trained not to see what they see. You'll regret this, Carol said. Not a threat exactly. Something that wanted to be but didn't quite have the confidence. Perhaps, I said. Goodbye, Carol. She left. I watched her go through the glass door and across the parking lot to her car, and I saw her sit there for several minutes before she drove away. And I did not know what she was feeling in that car. And I found that I had to remind myself not to care. I went back to my room and sat down on the edge of the bed. My hands were not shaking this time. But there was a cold place in my chest. Not quite fear, not quite grief. Some combination of both that had no clean name. She was my daughter. She had looked me in the face and tried to soften me into silence. And when that failed, she had shown me something underneath the softness that I recognized as dangerous. What if they escalated, I thought. What if Dennis, backed into a corner, did something that could not be managed through attorneys and legal filings? I breathed. I let the fear do what it always did. I let it tell me what was at stake. I let it remind me why I was not stopping. Then I picked up my phone and called Pat. Carol came today, I said. She tried to get me to drop the charges. When I refused, she said I would regret it. Documented? Pat asked. There are aides at Sunrise Gardens. Security cameras in the common room. I paused. Also, I believe Dennis may try something more direct before this is over. I want to be prepared for that. Let's talk through contingencies, Pat said. We talked for an hour. By the end of it, I was not afraid. I was ready. The hearing was on a Thursday in October, 7 weeks after I had first sat in Pat Holt's office and watched her pull up the Register of Deeds. It was not a criminal trial. Not yet. The criminal investigation remained active, with the Henderson County Sheriff's Office and the North Carolina Attorney General's Office, which had become involved given the elder financial exploitation statutes, conducting their own parallel process. What Thursday's hearing addressed was the civil matter, the challenge to the power of attorney and the deed transfer to Birchwood Properties, LLC. Pat had prepared me thoroughly. Daniel Cho would be present as consulting counsel. We had submitted to the court an evidentiary packet that was, Pat told me, unusually comprehensive for a case at this stage. We had the deed. We had the LLC registration, predating the power of attorney's preparation by 2 weeks, establishing a timeline of premeditation. We had forensic documentation of the 2 account transfers, totaling $18,000. We had a signed affidavit from the notary who had witnessed the power of attorney, a woman named Susan Greer, who stated under oath that she had been present solely to notarize the signature, that she had not been involved in explaining the document's contents to me, and that the document had been presented to her already prepared by Carol Fairchild. We had Ruth's affidavit, detailing what I had shared with her the morning after Carol's visit, the timeline of my discovery, and her paralegal's assessment of the document irregularities. We had 7 character witnesses prepared to speak to my mental competence, including Pastor Mills, Tiffany Prewett, and 3 members of my garden club. And we had one thing more, which Pat had obtained through a public records request and which we had chosen not to disclose to opposing counsel in advance within the letter of the rules. Bank statements for Birchwood Properties, LLC, obtained through the business registration filing requirements. 3 days after my home was transferred into the LLC, a loan had been initiated against the property I was still living in, legally, when the loan was taken out. The property that a retired paralegal and a woman in a blue cardigan had clouded the title on before that loan could be fully executed. The loan had not closed. The Ellis Pendens had caught it, but the attempt was documented. They had tried to borrow against my house within 72 hours of taking it. I wore a gray dress to the hearing and my best pearl earrings. Ruth drove me. We did not talk much in the car, but she reached over and patted my hand once at a traffic light, and I was grateful for it. Carol and Dennis were already in the courtroom when we arrived. Dennis wore a suit I did not recognize, expensive, which struck me as either confidence or desperation. Carol wore black, which I thought was unconsciously revealing. They had an attorney, a younger man named Garrett Shea, who had a reputation, Pat told me, for aggressive procedural motions. He led with competency. Within the first 15 minutes of the hearing, Shea argued that my cognitive state at the time of signing the power of attorney was uncertain, that I was a woman of advanced age living alone, and that the transaction represented my daughter's good faith effort to manage my affairs. He spoke about Carol's concern, her love, her years of caregiving. He was polished and not unconvincing. Pat let him finish. Then she stood up. She walked the court through the timeline. The LLC registration, March 3rd. The power of attorney prepared and signed, March 19th. The deed transfer, April 11th. The loan application, April 14th. The Ellis Pendens, April 22nd. She presented the financial records, the $18,000. She presented the Susan Greer affidavit. She presented the character witnesses, 3 of whom testified in person, briefly and clearly. about my crossword puzzles, and my garden, and my Tuesday lunches, and the woman they had known for decades. Then she presented me. I sat in the witness box, and I answered the questions Pat asked me. I described the morning Carol came. I described what I signed and what I understood it to mean. I described, carefully and without anger, the gap between what I had been told and what had in fact been done. I had notes. Pat had permitted me to refer to notes, which the court allowed, and I did not need them, but I had them, because I was not going to stumble. Shay cross-examined me for 20 minutes. He asked about my medication, about my memory, about whether I sometimes forgot things. I answered honestly. Yes, I sometimes misplaced my glasses. No, I had not forgotten what I signed. Yes, I understood the difference between a standard power of attorney and a general durable one. Would I explain it? I explained it. He sat down. Dennis was called. He testified that the LLC had been formed as an investment vehicle unrelated to my property, and that the transfer of my home into the LLC was a temporary protective measure suggested by their financial advisor. Pat asked if that financial advisor could be named and called to testify. There was a pause. Shay conferred with Dennis. There was no financial advisor, it emerged. The suggestion had come from Dennis himself. Pat asked about the loan application initiated 3 days after the transfer. Dennis said he didn't recall the specific timing. Pat introduced the bank documentation. Dennis said he wasn't certain of the details. Pat asked about the $18,000. Dennis said those were, he paused, shared household expenses that Dorothy had authorized. Pat asked for that authorization in writing. There was no authorization in writing. Carol was called. She sat in the witness box and she looked, for the first time since this began, genuinely frightened. Not the performed fear she had shown in the common room. Real fear. She answered Shay's questions in a voice that was barely above a murmur, and when Pat rose to cross-examine, Carol looked at me once, briefly, and I held her gaze and I did not look away. Pat asked Carol when she had first contacted the notary, Susan Greer. Carol said she didn't recall. Pat introduced a text message between Carol's number and Susan Greer's, obtained through the sheriff's investigation with the appropriate legal process. Dated 2 weeks before the power of attorney was signed. Carol asking if Greer was available for a document notarization, and describing the nature of the document in terms that were, Pat noted quietly to the court, inconsistent with Carol's claim that this was a standard update to an existing document. Carol looked at the text message on the screen. She said she had misremembered. Pat said that she had no further questions. The judge, a woman named Honorable Ellen Cross with 20 years on the bench and a manner that suggested she had seen every version of this particular story, called a brief recess. When she returned, she spoke for 11 minutes. I will not reproduce everything she said, but she found that the power of attorney had been obtained through deception and was therefore invalid from the date of execution. She found that the deed transfer to Birchwood Properties, LLC, was consequently void and ordered it unwound. She ordered the title to the property at Birchwood Lane to be restored to Dorothy Louise Marsh pending any appeal. She noted the ongoing criminal investigation and expressed that the civil record would be made available to law enforcement. Dennis stood up so abruptly his chair scraped the floor. Shay touched his arm. Dennis shook him off. He said something I won't repeat. The judge looked at him with an expression that cost him whatever instinct toward restraint he had remaining, and she noted for the record that his outburst had been observed. Carol did not stand. She sat very still, and I saw her put her face in her hands. I sat in my chair and I breathed. Outside the courthouse, in the pale October light, Ruth took my arm and we walked to the car without speaking. The magnolia tree was still on Birchwood Lane. It had been there the whole time. It was still mine. The weeks after the hearing moved with the particular momentum of things that have been set in motion and cannot be recalled. The civil ruling stood. Dennis and Shay filed a notice of appeal within the permitted window, which Pat told me was standard procedure, and which she also told me, with the precise confidence I had come to rely on, would almost certainly fail given the evidentiary record. She was right. The appellate court upheld the lower court's ruling 4 months later without requesting oral argument, which Pat told me was a signal of how little merit the appeal possessed. My home was returned to me. I walked through the front door on a Wednesday afternoon in November, with Ruth beside me and the spare key the neighbor Tiffany Prewett had been holding since I'd given it to her years ago for emergencies. The house smelled of disuse, that particular flat quality of air in a room that has been waiting, and every surface was exactly as I had left it. Carol and Dennis had never moved in. They had tried to monetize it without ever occupying it, which struck me as I stood in my own kitchen as telling. Even in their greed, they had not loved it. I opened all the windows. The criminal proceedings were slower, as criminal proceedings tend to be. The Henderson County Sheriff's Office, working with the North Carolina Attorney General's Elder Financial Exploitation Unit, had built a case against both Carol and Dennis over the course of the civil litigation. The charges, when they came, were not minor. Dennis was charged with financial exploitation of an elder adult, obtaining property by false pretenses, and criminal breach of fiduciary duty. Carol was charged with conspiracy to commit financial exploitation of an elder adult and forgery, the latter in connection with the power of attorney document, which forensic document analysis had determined contained language that had been added after the initial draft was shown to me, but before I signed the final version. That last detail is worth dwelling on. The document I had been shown at my kitchen table and the document I had signed were not identical. A paragraph had been added, the one granting authority over real property transactions, between my review and my signature. I had not been shown that paragraph. I had not agreed to it. Someone had inserted it. Carol's attorney, by the time of the criminal proceedings, was no longer Garrett Shay. Shay had withdrawn from the representation. Carol had a public defender because by that point, the financial exposure of the civil judgment, the legal fees, and the failed real estate transaction had left them without the resources to retain private counsel. Dennis pled guilty to financial exploitation of an elder adult in exchange for a reduced charge. He received a suspended sentence, 3 years of probation, and was required to make full restitution, the $18,000 in transferred funds, plus Pat's legal fees as assessed by the court, plus costs. He was also permanently barred, as a condition of his plea, from serving in any fiduciary capacity. Carol went to trial. I was called as a witness, and I testified again, more briefly this time, because the evidentiary record was already so comprehensive that the prosecution's case was not built primarily on my testimony, but on the documents, the forensics, the text messages, and Dennis's own statements. Carol was convicted of conspiracy and forgery. She received 2 years of supervised probation, mandatory restitution equivalent to Dennis's, and 200 hours of community service. No one went to prison. I want to be honest about that, because the world is not a place where justice is always as clean as we would like it to be, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. They did not go to prison, but they were convicted. It is in the public record. The guilty verdicts, the restitution orders, the names. Denise Fairchild and Carol Fairchild, Nemarche. There it is. The restitution came through over the following year in installments because they had very little money remaining. I did not need it urgently. Pat had worked with me on a reduced fee arrangement during the active litigation, and my savings, once I had full access restored, were enough to sustain me. but each payment arrived with the particular satisfaction of a thing that had been taken being returned, not because of forgiveness, but because the law had said this belongs to her. I asked Pat, near the end of it all, whether I had any remaining civil exposure, whether Carol or Dennis might sue me for something. She looked at me with an expression that was as close to amused as Pat Holt ever got, and said, "Dorothy, they could try. I would encourage them to." They did not try. Margaret Cho's nephew Daniel sent me a note after the appellate ruling, handwritten on good stationery. "It was an honor, Mrs. Marsh. Please give my regards to your garden." I put it in the lockbox next to the deed. The day I moved back into my house, I stood for a long time at the back window, looking at the magnolia tree. It was November, and the leaves were gone, the way they go in November. But the structure of it was all there. The branching, the height, the particular angle of it, the way George had planted it slightly too close to the fence, and we had argued gently about it for years, and he had been right in the end because it grew exactly the way it wanted to. The roots, Pat told me, were documented in the original property survey. Deep roots, hard to move. I set my kettle on and waited for it to boil, and I listened to my house, and it still knew me. Spring came to Birchwood Lane the way it always had, slowly, then all at once. By March, the magnolia was producing those great, improbable blossoms, pink-white and absurdly beautiful, for a tree that had simply continued through everything. Tiffany photographed it from the sidewalk and sent me the picture. I framed it. I spent the winter restoring the house to itself. New paint in the kitchen, the porch railing finally fixed, a burgundy velvet reading chair that George would have called extravagant. Ruth came Saturday mornings, and we sat on the porch and watched things grow. I was not unchanged. The months at Sunrise Gardens, the legal process, the grief of seeing something in my daughter's face I had not wanted to see, those could not be returned. The relationship with Carol was not repaired. That absence was its own presence, but I was more capable than before. Estate documents updated, copies with Ruth, Pastor Mills, and Daniel Cho. 3 people, none of them family. Carol and Dennis had separated. Dennis was no longer in insurance, struggling under restitution. Carol was working retail. She had her mother's stubbornness, and I hoped she would use it somewhere worth using it. On a Tuesday in April, I sat on the porch with my coffee and my crossword, and the morning sun in the oak trees, and I finished the puzzle in ink. I was 75 years old. I was home. What would you have done, sitting alone at 5 in the morning, looking at a magnolia tree that might no longer be yours? Leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening. I am Dorothy Marsh, and I am still here. My son told me, at 72, "Go to a nursing home, Mom. We don't want you around." They were already dividing up my house. His wife nodded and threw my belongings out the door. I smirked and walked away. What they didn't know was that the house was actually... Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say that trouble announces itself, that there are signs, if only you pay attention. Well, I paid attention my whole life. To my husband Frank, to our son Derek, to the house we built on Maple Creek Road with our own hands and our own savings. I paid attention for 50 years, and still, when the trouble finally came, it wore a face I loved, or thought I loved. Frank passed in the spring of 2019. Pancreatic cancer. 3 months from diagnosis to the end. We had 46 years together, Frank and I won't pretend those years were always easy. But they were ours. After the funeral, After the flowers wilted and the casseroles stopped appearing on the porch, I was left alone in that house on Maple Creek Road. The white clapboard colonial with the green shutters and the big oak in the yard that Frank had planted himself when Derek was born. I had my garden. I had my neighbor Dorothy 2 doors down. I had my book club on Tuesday evenings. I was 72 years old. I was grieving, but I was not helpless. Not by a long shot. Derek came by more often after Frank died. At first, I was grateful. He would sit at my kitchen table, drink my coffee, ask how I was sleeping. He was my son. Of course I was glad to see him. What mother wouldn't be? But Linda came too. Linda, his wife of 12 years, whom I had always found pleasant in the way that a hotel lobby is pleasant. Clean, well-maintained, and belonging to someone else's life. She started commenting on things. Small things, at first. Mom, this kitchen could really use some updating. Mom, have you thought about downsizing? This house is so big for one person. Mom, do you really need 3 bedrooms? I smiled and changed the subject. I assumed it was her way of caring. I was wrong about that. By the summer of 2021, the comments had a different texture. Derek started asking questions about the house. Practical questions. What was the mortgage situation? Had I updated my will? Was I still paying the property taxes myself? Or did I want him to help manage the finances? I told him. Frank and I had paid off the mortgage in 2003, that my finances were in fine order, and that I appreciated his concern, but did not require his management. He looked at Linda. Linda looks back at Derek. That exchange, that silent, sidelong look between them, was the first time I felt something cold move through me. The second time was at Thanksgiving, 2021. The whole family gathered. Derek and Linda, their 2 kids Bryce and Kayla, Derek's cousin Paul and his girlfriend. Dinner was fine. The turkey was fine. But after the dishes were cleared, Bryce, 17 years old, a boy I had bounced on my knee, made a joke at the table. Grandma, when you move to the old folks' home, can I have your room? Everyone laughed. Everyone except me and Dorothy, who had joined us that year because her own family was far away. I looked at Bryce. I looked at Derek. Derek was laughing too. I excused myself to the kitchen and stood at the sink for a moment, looking out at the oak tree in the yard. Frank's tree. The one he'd planted 50 years ago. Had I misunderstood? Was it just a thoughtless joke from a teenager? I told myself yes. I told myself I was being paranoid. I went back to the table and passed the pie. I wish I had trusted that cold feeling sooner. The final sign came on a Tuesday in February of 2022. Derek called and asked if he and Linda could come over that weekend. I said of course. They arrived on Saturday morning, earlier than I expected. I was still in my housecoat when I heard the door. They sat down at my kitchen table without waiting to be invited, which they had never done before. Linda laid her handbag on the counter, like she owned the place. And then Derek looked at me with an expression I did not recognize on my son's face. Not anger, exactly. Something more calculated than anger. Mom, he said, we think it's time to have a serious conversation. What followed were 20 minutes I will never forget as long as I live. Derek told me that the house was too much for me, that I was getting older, that there was a very nice facility in Westbrook, 40 minutes away, that had availability, that he and Linda had already spoken to someone there, that they had discussed the situation, those were his words, the situation, as though I were a problem to be managed, and that they felt it was best for everyone, as though I were not part of everyone. Lind nodded along to every sentence. She had already, I noticed, begun looking at the walls, at Frank's bookshelves, at the framed photographs, at the curtains I had sewn myself in 1987. She was measuring the place with her eyes. You need to go to a care home, Mom, Derek said. We don't want to keep coming out here. It's too far. We have our own lives. I sat very still. I felt 72 years of my life pressing against the backs of my eyes. Then I looked at my son, this boy I had raised, this man I had loved, and I smiled. All right, I said quietly. I got up, walked to the front door and opened it. Then I'll be going, I said. They stared at me. Linda looked confused. Derek opened his mouth. I walked out the door, got in my car, and drove away. They didn't call after me, and they had no idea, not one idea, what was waiting for them. I drove for 20 minutes before I pulled over. I was on Route 9, in the parking lot of the old Kmart that had been a furniture store for a while and was now nothing at all, just a big, empty building with a peeling sign. I sat in my car with both hands on the steering wheel, and I breathed. In and out. In and out. The way my doctor had taught me after Frank's diagnosis, when I used to wake at 3 a.m. with my heart going too fast. Was I being dramatic? That was my first thought. My mother's voice, dead 20 years, rose up in my head. Peggy, don't make a scene. Don't be difficult. He's your son. I had heard that voice my whole life. I had listened to it more than I should have. But this was not a scene. This was my son telling me to leave my home. This was his wife measuring my walls with her eyes while he talked. This was the word facility used like it was a kindness. I sat in that parking lot for a long time, and I counted. I counted what I had. The house on Maple Creek Road, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, the big oak in the front yard, the garden Frank and I had kept for 30 years, the workshop in the back where he used to build furniture and where I now kept my tools and my potting soil and the smell of him. Still, somehow, after 3 years. I had Social Security, Frank's pension, and approximately $190,000 in a savings account at First National that Derek did not know the balance of because it was none of his business. I had my health, which was good for my age, some arthritis in my right hand, blood pressure managed with medication, and a stubbornness that my doctor called a medical asset. I counted what I stood to lose: my home, my garden, the workshop, the oak tree, my independence, my dignity, and then I counted the thing that scared me most. I did not know, with absolute certainty, how the house was titled. Frank had handled most of the legal paperwork over the years. I knew the mortgage was paid off. I knew we had owned the house jointly during our marriage. But when Frank died, we had been in such a fog of grief and illness that I had signed whatever the estate attorney put in front of me without fully understanding all of it. I had trusted that it was all in order. I had been a woman who trusted my whole life that the people around me had things in order. What if I had been wrong about that? The thought was not paranoia. It was a legitimate question, and it required a legitimate answer. I started the car and drove to Dorothy's house. Dorothy Weiss was 75 years old, a retired paralegal, and the sharpest person I knew. She had been widowed longer than me. Her husband Harold had died in 2011, and she had emerged from that loss with a particular practical clarity that I had always admired. She opened her door before I could knock because she had seen my car pull up, and she took one look at my face. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." I sat at her kitchen table, smaller than mine, cluttered with crossword puzzles and library books, and told her everything. Derek and Linda's visit. What Derek had said. What Linda had done with her eyes. I told her about the Thanksgiving comment from Bryce. I told her about the months of questions about finances and the house. I told her about the look Derek and Linda had exchanged, that silent, sidelong look that had made something cold move through me months ago. Dorothy listened without interrupting, which is a rarer skill than people realize. When I finished, she set her cup down. "Peggy, she said. Do you know how your house is titled? Not with certainty, I said. That's your first problem, she said, and it has a simple solution. You need to get your hands on the deed. She was right. It was that simple and that urgent. I needed to know exactly what I owned, in exactly what legal form, before Derek and Linda took any further steps. Because people like Linda, people who measured walls with their eyes, did not come to a conversation like that one without having done some research. They had thought about this. They had planned. Had they already spoken to an attorney? I didn't know, but I intended to find out. That afternoon, Dorothy helped me write a list. Not an emotional list, not a list of grievances or a list of everything that hurt, though that list existed too, somewhere deeper than paper. This was a practical list. First, obtain a copy of the property deed from the county recorder's office. Second, locate Frank's original will and the estate documents from 2019. Third, make an appointment with an attorney, not the one who had handled Frank's estate, someone new, someone who had no history with the family. Fourth, say nothing to Derek. That last item was the most important. I drove home as the sun was going down, the orange light coming through the oak's bare February branches. I walked through my front door, and I stood in the hallway and looked at the photographs on the wall. Frank at 30, lean and sunburned, holding a baby Derek. Frank and me at Niagara Falls in 1984. Derek at his high school graduation, 1990, squinting into the camera with that crooked smile. I loved him still. That was the honest truth. You do not stop loving your children because they hurt you. But love, I was learning at 72, is not the same thing as surrender. I went to Frank's old filing cabinet in the study. I found the manila folders labeled in his handwriting: house, insurance, taxes, wills. I sat down on the floor, right there, and began to read. Frank was an organized man. I had always known that, but sitting on the floor of his study at 9 o'clock on a February night, going through his filing cabinet, I felt the full weight of it. Every document labeled, every date noted in the margin, every renewal and update tracked in his small, precise handwriting. He had loved me in 100 ways, and one of them was this: he had kept records. The property deed was in the folder marked house, behind the paid-off mortgage certificate and the original 1979 purchase agreement. I unfolded it carefully. It was a single page, and I read it 3 times. The house on Maple Creek Road was titled, as of Frank's death in 2019, in my name alone. Margaret Ellen Callahan. Not jointly, not in trust. In my name, with full right of ownership and transfer. I sat with that piece of paper in my hands for a long time. The estate attorney in 2019 had converted the joint tenancy to sole ownership in my name upon Frank's death, which was standard procedure and which I had signed for without fully absorbing. I had been so deep in grief at the time that the legal details had passed over me like water over stone, leaving no impression. But Frank had known. He had made sure it was done properly. He had protected me even from beyond his diagnosis, even in those last terrible weeks. Why hadn't I read these papers sooner? I knew the answer. Because I had believed all my life that my family would not require me to defend myself. That belief was now retired. I made photocopies of the deed, the will, and the estate transfer documents using the little printer copier Frank had kept on his desk. I put the originals back in the folder. The copies I put in a plain envelope, which I tucked into my handbag. Then I made a cup of chamomile tea, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote down the name Dorothy had given me. Robert Alden, Esquire. Elder Law and Estate Planning. Harmon, Connecticut. I called his office the next morning and made an appointment for Thursday. The office of Robert Alden was on the second floor of a brick building on Center Street in Harmon, above a dry cleaner's and a small accounting firm. It smelled like old books and good coffee. Robert Alden himself was in his mid-60s, calm-faced, with wire-rimmed glasses and the particular patience of a man who had spent decades listening to people in distress. His assistant showed me in. I sat down and told him everything. He listened the way Dorothy had listened, without interrupting. When I finished, I laid the photocopied documents on his desk. He read them in silence. "Mrs. Callahan," he said at last, "the good news is that your ownership of this property is legally unambiguous. You are the sole owner of record. Your son has no legal claim to this house." "But," I said, because there was a but in his voice. "But," he said carefully, "there are ways that can change. If you were to sign anything, any document presented to you as routine paperwork, a new will, a power of attorney, without fully understanding its implications, that could create complications. Has your son asked you to sign anything recently?" I thought about it. "Not yet," I said. "But he's been asking questions about the finances, about whether I have everything in order." Mr. Alden nodded slowly. "I'd like to suggest two things. First, let me review your current will and any existing powers of attorney. Second, I'd like to draft a document for your records confirming your explicit intent that this property remains solely in your name and is not to be transferred without the involvement of this office." He paused. "Mrs. Callahan, I want to ask you something directly. Do you have any reason to believe your son has already taken any legal steps regarding your property or your estate?" I had not expected the question. I sat with it for a moment. "I think I need to find out," I said. Mr. Alden referred me to a colleague who could do a title search, a formal check of whether any liens, inquiries, or transfer documents had been filed against my property. I authorized it on the spot. It cost $150, which I paid in cash. The results came 4 days later, by email, which Mr. Alden's assistant forwarded to Dorothy's address at my request, because I was not confident Derek didn't have access to my email account. I had set it up years ago with his help, and I had never changed the password. I changed it that afternoon. The title search showed one item I had not expected. 3 weeks prior, the week before Derek and Linda's visit to my kitchen, someone had filed an informal inquiry with the County Property Records Office regarding the ownership status of 14 Maple Creek Road. The inquiry was not a legal action. It was the kind of question a person asks before they take legal action. It was filed under the name of a law firm, Garrett and Associates, Hartford. I sat at Dorothy's kitchen table and read that line 3 times. My son had hired a lawyer before he came to tell me to go to a care home. He had done his research. He had made his plans. And then he had sat at my kitchen table and called it a conversation. Dorothy watched my face while I read. She didn't say anything. She poured more tea. "I'm not going anywhere," I said finally. My voice surprised me. It was very quiet and very steady. "I know," Dorothy said. "He didn't know about the deed," I said. "He assumed the house was still in both names, or that I didn't understand what I owned. He thought I was an old woman who hadn't read her own paperwork." "He was wrong," Dorothy said. "Yes," I said. "He was." I called Mr. Alden that evening. I told him what the title search had found. There was a brief silence on his end. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "I'd like to suggest we move fairly quickly." "So would I said. The plan, as Mr. Alden and I developed it over the following week, was not dramatic. It was careful, thorough, and entirely legal, which, as he pointed out, was the only kind of plan that mattered. First, I updated my will. The existing will, drafted in 2018, left the house and the majority of my estate to Derek as sole beneficiary. Mr. Alden and I revised it. The new will established a small family trust, with Dorothy named as co-trustee alongside a neutral third-party trust company affiliated with Mr. Alden's firm. The house would remain mine for my lifetime. Upon my death, it would be sold, and the proceeds distributed equally among Derek's 2 children, Bryce and Kayla, with the stipulation that Derek and Linda had no role in administering the trust. It was not a punitive document. It was a protective one. Second, I granted a limited power of attorney to Mr. Alden's firm, covering any real estate transactions involving 14 Maple Creek Road. This meant that if anyone attempted to transfer, encumber, or alter the title of the property, the transaction would require sign-off from his office. Without that, nothing could move. Third, I changed the password on my email, my bank accounts, and the online portal for the county property records. I also changed the locks on the house. Not because I expected Derek to break in, I didn't think him capable of that, but because he had a spare key, and I no longer wanted him to have access I hadn't consciously granted. I did all of this in 8 days. I told no one except Dorothy and Mr. Alden. On the 9th day, Derek called. He opened the conversation pleasantly, asked how I was sleeping, mentioned that the weather had been cold, said that Kayla had gotten a good grade on a school project. I answered each question briefly and waited. There was a particular quality to his pleasantness that I recognized now for what it was, the sound of a man running a script. "Mom," he said, after the pleasantries were exhausted, "Linda and I have been thinking. We'd like to come by this weekend and talk things through properly. We felt like the last conversation got a little tense." A little tense? He had told me to go to a nursing home, and his wife had visually inventoried my furniture, and that was a little tense. "Of course," I said. "Come Sunday, 2 o'clock. They arrived at exactly 2. Linda laid her handbag on the counter again. I had moved a kitchen chair so that she would have to choose a different spot. A small thing, but mine. We sat. I offered coffee. The conversation began in the same pleasant scripted way, and then Derek shifted. His voice changed, lower, more deliberate. "Mom, I'm going to be honest with you. I've been looking into things. The house, the estate situation, and I think you may not fully understand what you own and how it's structured." I looked at him. "What makes you think that, Derek?" "Well, after Dad died, there were a lot of documents. You were grieving. It's possible things weren't set up the way you think they were." He paused. "I'd like you to come with me to speak to an attorney, someone who can explain the situation clearly." Someone he had already briefed. "I already have an attorney," I said. The room changed. It was subtle. A slight stillness. A recalibration behind Derek's eyes. Linda's hand stopped moving on the handle of her coffee cup. "Since when?" Derek asked. "Recently," I said. "Mom, you don't need to," Derek began. "His name is Robert Alden," I said. "He practices elder law in Harmon. He's reviewed all my documents. Everything is in order." I paused. Everything. The word landed precisely where I intended it to. Derek's jaw tightened. "You should have told me you were doing this." "Why?" I asked. He didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, he had an answer, but no version of it was one he could say out loud. Linda spoke then, for the first time since they'd arrived. Her voice had lost its hotel lobby pleasantness. "Peggy, you're making this into something it isn't. We're just trying to help you. You're 72 years old, you're living alone in a big house, and we worry. That's all this is." "I appreciate the concern," I said. "My attorney has also noted for the record that the house is titled solely in my name and that I am legally competent to make all decisions regarding it." He was quite clear on that point. Another silence. Longer this time. Derek stood up. His face was controlled, but his hands, I noticed his hands. They were pressed flat against the table, which is what people do when they want to make fists and are stopping themselves. "You've made a mistake," he said quietly. "That's possible," I said, "but it's mine to make." They left. I stood at the window and watched their car back out of the driveway and disappear around the corner. My heart was beating faster than usual, but my hands were steady. And then, for the first time since February, I sat down on the couch, pulled Frank's old wool blanket over my legs, and let myself rest. I gave myself 3 days. 3 days of garden catalogs and Dorothy's company, and very bad television and chamomile tea, and not thinking about Derek or Linda or the look on his face when I said the word attorney. 3 days of being a person, not a combatant. Frank used to say, "Rest is not retreat." He was right about most things. The call came on a Wednesday, 3 days after Derek and Linda had left my house in that charged silence. It was Linda who called, not Derek, which told me something right away. When Derek was angry, he went quiet and waited. When Linda wanted something, she moved. She was warm on the phone, warmer than I had heard her in years, actually. She apologized for the tension of Sunday's visit. She said she and Derek had talked and realized they'd been clumsy in expressing their concern. She said, and I could hear the preparation in it, the rehearsed naturalness, that they wanted to make things right. As a gesture of goodwill, she said, they would like to take me to dinner on Friday. Somewhere nice. Your choice, Peggy. Wherever you'd like to go. There was also, she mentioned, almost as an aside, the kind of aside that is never actually an aside, a possibility she wanted to discuss with me. Derek had been speaking with his financial advisor. There was an arrangement, apparently, that could be quite beneficial for me. A way to simplify things. A way to make sure everyone was protected. An arrangement. I turned the word over in my mind after I hung up. Arrangements, in my experience, protect the person proposing them. I told Dorothy about the call that afternoon. We were sitting in her living room, which smelled like cinnamon and old paperback novels. They want to try a softer approach, Dorothy said. Yes, I said. What will you do? Go to dinner, I said, and listen very carefully. Dorothy nodded. Then she said, Peggy, can I say something? You always do, I said, which made her smile. You need more than me, she said. I can be your practical support, but you need people who've been through something like this, who understand what it is to be in your position. She paused. My niece Barbara runs a support group at the community center. Elder advocacy. It's not a sad group. Please don't make that face. It's practical. Legal resources, social workers, people who know how to navigate exactly this kind of situation. I made the face anyway. I had spent 72 years not being the kind of woman who went to support groups. Just once, Dorothy said. Go once. I went on Thursday. The Harmon Community Center was a low brick building on Elm Street, the kind of place that hosted polling stations and blood drives and children's birthday parties, and apparently groups of older people who were navigating what the facilitator, a cheerful, no-nonsense woman named Gloria in her early 60s, called family boundary challenges. Which was, I quickly understood, a polite way of saying families trying to take things from their elderly members. There were 8 people in the circle that Thursday evening. A man named Harold, 80, whose daughter had moved into his house temporarily 18 months ago and was still there. A woman named Ruth, 77, whose son had emptied her checking account using a power of attorney she didn't recall signing. A couple, Evelyn and Jim, both in their mid-70s, whose children were fighting each other in court over who would get to manage the parents' assets without consulting the parents at all. I sat in my plastic chair and listened. I had come prepared to be grateful, but unmoved. Instead, I found myself undone, not by sadness, but by recognition. These were not helpless people. These were people who had built things and raised families and lived full lives and were now being treated as inconveniences. How had we all arrived at the same place? I didn't speak much that first evening, but I listened. And when Gloria asked at the end if anyone had a resource they'd found useful, I mentioned Mr. Alden's name. 3 people wrote it down. After the meeting, a woman named Patricia, 70, recently divorced, bright-eyed and precise, stopped me on the way out. She had a son with a similar situation to mine, she said. She had also hired an attorney, also changed her estate documents. We exchanged phone numbers. I drove home with the odd lightness of a person who has discovered they are not alone. Friday's dinner was at Rosario's, an Italian restaurant in West Hartford that Derek and Linda had always liked more than I did. The food was fine, the candles were lit, and Linda was charming in a way that cost her visible effort. She asked about my garden. She asked about Dorothy. She complimented my blouse. And then Derek, over the osso buco, explained the arrangement. It was a life estate deed, he said. I would sign the house over to him, but retain the legal right to live there until my death. It would simplify the estate process, he said. Avoid probate. It was all very normal, he said. Very common. Very common. I looked at my son across the candlelit table. I thought about what Mr. Alden had told me about life estate deeds, that once signed, they give the future owner, in this case Derek, the legal right to sell or mortgage the property, with the current resident retaining only the right to occupy. That it removed my ability to sell, refinance, or change beneficiaries without Derek's consent. That it would, in effect, hand him control of the property while I was still alive. I'll think about it, I said pleasantly. Mom? I'll think about it, I repeated. I ate my tiramisu. I thanked them for dinner. I drove myself home. The oak tree was silver in the headlights when I pulled in. I sat in the car for a moment and looked at it. No, I thought simply. Not a chance. 2 weeks passed after the dinner at Rosario's. I returned to my regular rhythm. The garden, Dorothy, the Thursday evening group at the community center, phone calls with my new friend Patricia, twice weekly check-ins with Mr. Alden's office to confirm that no new filings had appeared against my property. None had. Derek did not call. The silence felt strategic. I was in the garden on a Saturday morning in early March, the ground still too cold to plant, but right for turning, when I heard a car in the driveway. I straightened up and turned around. Derek and Linda. Together. And behind them, in the back seat, both kids, Bryce and Kayla. They had brought the children. Why had they brought the children? I understood immediately. It was staging. You don't bring your children to a confrontation. You bring them to a performance of normalcy. To a scene meant to say, look, we are a family. We are only here because we love you. It was, I thought, a revealing choice. Because a person who is acting in good faith does not need props. I pulled off my garden gloves and walked to the porch. We were in the neighborhood, Linda said, smiling. Thought we'd stop by. No one is ever simply in the neighborhood at 9:30 on a Saturday morning with a prepared agenda. But I held the door open and let them in. Bryce and Kayla went to the living room and sat with their phones. Derek and Linda sat at my kitchen table. I made coffee. The normalcy of the scene was meticulous and false, like a stage set assembled overnight. Everything in its right place and nothing actually real. Derek began gently. He said he had thought a lot about our last conversation. He said he understood he had handled things badly in February. He wanted to start over. He laid his hands on the table, open-palmed, the gesture of a man showing he's unarmed. He was convincing. I will give him that. If I had not already seen the title search, if I had not already sat in Robert Alden's office and understood what a life estate deed actually does, I might have believed him. Mom, he said, I love you. I just want what's best for you. I know, I said. So I need you to understand that all of this, he paused, the attorney, the locks, whatever you've done, it's not necessary. It just creates distance. It makes things complicated and cold between us, and I don't want that. Complicated how? I asked. Linda stepped in then, her voice smooth. Peggy, nobody is trying to take anything from you. We want to help you manage things. You're at an age where it makes sense to have family involved. That's all. She folded her hands on the table as if in a business meeting. The life estate idea, it protects you. It guarantees you can stay in your home. We don't understand why you're treating us like enemies. I looked at her. I thought about the title search, about the law firm, Garrett and Associates, that Derek had quietly consulted before coming to tell me to go to a care home, about the document she had just described, which Mr. Alden had explained would legally transfer practical control of the property to Derek while I was still living in it, about the way she had set her handbag on my counter as though she were already at home. You hired an attorney to research my property before you talked to me, I said, 3 weeks before. The silence that followed had a different quality than the earlier ones. This one had weight. Derek's open-palmed gesture disappeared, his hands folded. That was just, we were doing due diligence. We needed to understand what you might be entitled to, I said quietly. Mom. His voice sharpened. You are making this into something ugly when it doesn't have to be. We have been patient. We have tried to talk to you like adults. You are behaving. How am I behaving, Derek? Another silence. Kayla, in the living room, looked up from her phone. Even the children could feel it now. Linda leaned forward. Her hotel lobby pleasantness was entirely gone, and what was under it was harder and less forgiving. Peggy, she said, I'm going to be very clear with you. If you continue down this road, the attorneys, the distrust, all of this, you are going to destroy this family. Is that what you want? To spend whatever years you have left alone, with no family? Is that the life you want? Is that the life you want? The oldest threat in the family playbook. Love as a hostage. I had heard variations of this threat my entire adult life. From mothers-in-law, from difficult neighbors, from people who confused affection with ownership. What surprised me was hearing it from my own son's wife, at my own kitchen table, in the house I had lived in for 40 years. I have family, I said. Dorothy is 2 doors down. I have friends. I have a full life. I paused. What I am choosing not to have is people managing my property without my knowledge. Derek stood up. The chair scraped the floor, a harsh, ugly sound in the quiet kitchen. We're done trying, he said. His voice was tight, clipped, stripped of the careful pleasantness he had arrived with. We've tried to do this the right way and you won't let us. Fine. We're done. Linda picked up her handbag from the counter, from the spot she always placed it, as though it belonged there. She walked past me without another word. Derek called to the kids. Bryce walked past me with his eyes on the floor, his shoulders hunched in the particular misery of a teenager who has witnessed his parents behave badly and cannot intervene. Kayla, 16, quieter than her brother, paused at the kitchen doorway. She looked at me for a moment. I saw something in her face that was not her parents' calculation. It was just sadness. The clear, uncomplicated sadness of a child who understands more than the adults think. Bye, Grandma, she said softly. Goodbye, sweetheart, I said. They left. The door closed. I stood in my kitchen, and I breathed. My hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly. Not with age, with adrenaline. I had held myself very steady through that entire conversation, and the effort of it had cost something real. I felt the fear that I had been managing for weeks rise up briefly, clean and sharp. What if this got worse? What if Derek escalated? What if he found some angle I hadn't anticipated? What if, in the end, the cost of winning was losing my son entirely? But the fear didn't settle. It moved through me and left behind something harder and more durable. Something that felt, if I am honest, like clarity. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Alden. "It's time," I said, "to move to the next step." Mr. Alden had been preparing for 2 weeks. So had I. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning at 10 in Mr. Alden's office on Center Street in Harmon. I had invited Derek by letter, a formal letter sent by certified mail, which Mr. Alden had advised, so that there would be a record of delivery and no possibility of Derek claiming later that he hadn't understood the nature of the meeting. The letter stated simply that I wished to discuss certain matters relating to my estate and property, and that I would appreciate his presence. It was signed by me, with Mr. Alden's firm listed in the letterhead. Formal, unambiguous. Derek called the moment he received it. "What is this?" he demanded. "Why are you sending me certified letters through a lawyer? What's going on?" "Please come Tuesday at 10, I said. "Everything will be explained." He came. He brought Linda. He brought, to my mild surprise, his own attorney, the younger man named Garrett, from the firm listed in the title search report. So Derek had finally made his representation official. He had stopped pretending this was a family conversation and admitted, at least to himself, that it was a legal one. Good. That was better, actually. Cleaner. It meant we could all stop performing. They arrived 4 minutes late, which may have been intentional. A small power move, the kind that announces itself by being just noticeable enough. I was already seated when they walked in. I had arrived 20 minutes early. Mr. Alden sat beside me. Across the table were 2 additional chairs for Derek and his attorney. Linda sat in a chair slightly back from the table, which placed her, visually, in a secondary position. These are small things, but in a room where everything is being observed, small things matter. Also in the room, seated quietly against the wall with a legal pad, was a woman named Carol Simmons, a licensed social worker who specialized in elder advocacy and who had agreed to serve as a neutral witness. Her presence was Mr. Alden's suggestion. Nothing clarifies people's behavior, he had told me the week before, like the presence of a professional witness whose role is simply to document it. Derek looked at Carol when he came in. "Who is that?" he asked. "A witness," Mr. Alden said pleasantly. "Thank you for coming." Mr. Alden opened the meeting with the efficient calm of a man who had done this many times and felt no need to dramatize it. He summarized the legal status of 14 Maple Creek Road. Sole ownership by Margaret Ellen Callahan. Updated estate documents on file. Limited power of attorney held by his firm for any real estate transactions. He placed certified copies of each document on the table, aligned precisely, one set for each party. Derek's attorney, young Garrett, picked them up and read them. His expression, which had begun with a certain practiced preparatory confidence, shifted as he read. He read the power of attorney clause twice. "These documents were updated recently," Garrett said. "In February," Mr. Alden confirmed. "All properly executed, witnessed, notarized, and filed with the county." Derek leaned forward. "Mom, why are you doing this? Why are you turning this into a legal proceeding? We are your family." "I know," I said. "That's why I wanted everything documented." "You don't trust me." "Derek," I said, and I kept my voice very steady. "You hired an attorney to research my property before you came to tell me I should go to a care home. That is documented." I slid a copy of the title search report across the table. One clean sheet, the Garrett and Associates filing date, clearly printed at the top. "The inquiry was filed 3 weeks before your visit in February. Before that conversation, I had done nothing to indicate I was planning any changes to my estate. There was no reason to research my property title unless you were planning something." The room was very quiet. Even Carol's pen had stopped moving. Derek looked at the paper. Then he looked at his own attorney. Garrett said nothing, which was itself an answer. "That's not," Derek started. "That was just to understand the situation." "What situation?" I asked. "I hadn't raised any estate questions with you. Frank's estate had been settled for 3 years. What situation required researching my property title without my knowledge or consent?" He had no answer. The silence stretched to 10 seconds, which is a very long time in a room where 5 people are waiting. Linda spoke instead. She leaned forward, her voice tight with a fury she was only partially containing. "This is an ambush. You invited us here to humiliate us in front of strangers." "I invited you here," I said, "to have a transparent conversation about my legal situation, which I have every right to conduct in the presence of my attorney and a professional witness." I paused, and I let the pause do its work. "You researched my property in secret. You proposed a deed structure that would have transferred practical control of my house to Derek while I was still living in it. And when I declined, you came to my home and told me I would die alone if I didn't comply." I looked at her directly. "I don't believe I am the one who arranged the ambush." Carol Simmons made a quiet, deliberate note. Linda looked at her. For the first time since they had arrived, something in Linda's composure cracked. Not dramatically, but visibly. A tightening around the eyes, a recognition that she was being observed and recorded, and that what was being recorded was not flattering. Derek's attorney leaned over and spoke quietly in his ear. Derek listened. His jaw worked. He looked, for a long moment, at the copy of the title search on the table in front of him. His own firm's name printed clearly at the top, the date of the filing printed below it. Evidence he could not dispute because he had generated it himself. "What exactly do you want?" Derek said at last. His voice had changed completely. The script was gone. He sounded tired, and underneath the tiredness, something I had not heard from him in years. Young. He sounded briefly like the boy who used to sit in this very kitchen doing homework at the table while I made dinner. The boy who, when he was 8 years old and had broken a neighbor's window with a baseball, had come home and told me before the neighbor called, because he couldn't bear the weight of a secret. Where had that boy gone, I wondered. And then I thought, he's still here. He's just been buried under 12 years of Linda and financial pressure and the particular corrosion that sets in when people start treating other people as resources. "I want to live in my home," I said. "I want to make my own decisions about my property and my estate. I want no interference, no pressure, and no further consultations with attorneys about my title without my knowledge." I looked at him steadily. "That's all I've ever wanted, Derek. To be left to my own life." Garrett collected his papers and said, "I think my client and I need a moment." He and Derek stepped into the hallway. Linda remained at the table, very still, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look at me. She looked at her hands, or perhaps at something beyond them, at the shape of what had just happened, at the distance between where she had expected to be today and where she actually was. What was she thinking, I wondered? And then I realized, with a clarity that surprised me, that I genuinely did not need to know. Derek and Garrett were in the hallway for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on Mr. Alden's wall. A plain, round clock, white face, black hands, the kind that had hung in every office and classroom since I was a child. I watched the seconds move, and I breathed, and I did not fidget, and I did not speak, and I was not afraid. Linda sat across the table without moving. Carol Simmons made occasional small notes. Mr. Alden poured water from a pitcher on his desk and offered it to everyone. Only I accepted. When Derek came back in, he looked like a man who had had something explained to him that he did not enjoy understanding. Garrett followed, and sat down with the particular careful composure of an attorney who has just advised his client to abandon a losing position. "My client," Garrett said, "acknowledges that the property documentation is in order and that there are no current grounds for any legal action regarding the estate or title of 14 Maple Creek Road." Mr. Alden nodded. "Noted." Derek looked at me. "Mom, I have a document," Mr. Alden said, "which I would ask you to sign before you leave. It is a simple acknowledgement, non-binding in the punitive sense but on record, that you have been informed of the current estate structure and have no current legal claim to the property." Garrett reviewed it for 3 minutes. It was 2 paragraphs long. He conferred again with Derek, briefly. Derek picked up the pen. He signed it. His hand moved quickly, the way people sign things they don't want to examine too closely. Linda was not asked to sign. She had no legal standing in the matter, but she watched Derek's hand on the pen with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not anger, exactly. It was the look of a person watching a door close on something they had badly wanted. Had she been the one who pushed this? Had she been the architect? I had wondered about that for months. I wondered it again now, looking at her face. Derek had never been calculating, not really. As a boy, he had been impulsive, big-hearted, sloppy with his feelings. The methodical nature of what they had attempted, the quiet attorney's inquiry, the staged conversation, the rehearsed dinner, the life estate proposal, had his wife's precision about it. But it didn't matter now. What mattered was the signature on the paper. Mr. Alden made copies. He gave one to Garrett. He filed the original. He handed me mine in a clean white envelope, and I put it in my handbag next to my copy of the deed. The meeting was over. We all stood. There were no handshakes. Derek moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to me. His expression was very difficult to read. There were too many things in it, and they were too tangled. Anger, I thought, was the least of them. Underneath were older things. Shame. Something that might, someday, become regret. "I didn't think you'd do this," he said quietly. It was not quite an accusation. "I know," I said. "Dad would have—" "Your father," I said carefully, "titled the house in my name alone. He did that deliberately. He knew who he was protecting it for." I paused. "He knew me, Derek." Something moved across my son's face. His chin dipped briefly. Then he walked out the door. Linda followed without a word. I stood in Robert Alden's office and listened to their footsteps recede down the stairs, and to the faint sound of the dry cleaner's machines below, and to the ordinary quiet of Center Street on a Tuesday morning. "Well?" Mr. Alden said. "Yes," I said. He offered his hand and I shook it. I thanked Carol Simmons, who gave me her card and said she hoped I wouldn't need it again, but that it was good to have. I put my coat on. I picked up my handbag. I walked downstairs and out onto Center Street. It was a cold March morning, but clear. That particular hard, brilliant clarity that comes sometimes in late winter, when the sky looks as though it's been washed. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at it. What now? I drove home on Route 9, past the empty Kmart parking lot where I had pulled over in February, with my hands on the steering wheel and my heart going too fast. I didn't stop this time. I drove straight home, turned onto Maple Creek Road, and pulled into my own driveway. The oak tree stood in the front yard, massive and bare-branched against that clear blue sky. I got out of the car. I walked up the porch steps. I unlocked my own front door with my own key. I went inside. And then I sat down at the kitchen table in my quiet house, and I cried. Not from sadness, from the strange, overwhelming relief of a battle finally finished, the kind of crying that happens when you have been holding yourself together for a very long time and the need to is suddenly over. I let myself cry for 10 minutes. Then I washed my face, put the kettle on, and called Dorothy. "It's done," I said. "Good," she said. "Come over for dinner." I went. Spring came to Maple Creek Road in April, slowly at first, then all at once. Frank's daffodils pushed up exactly where they were supposed to. I put in tomatoes and zinnias because I wanted color, and I was going to have it. I was 73, and I felt better than I had in years. The heaviness of February was gone. I woke without it. I drank my coffee in the garden and watched the light through the oak tree with the contentment of a person who is exactly where she wants to be. Dorothy, Patricia, Evelyn, and Jim, my people. Dinners, walks, phone calls, watercolor class on Tuesdays. A full life, honestly fuller than before. In June, I signed up for ceramics, something Frank had always teased me about. By September, I had a set of irregular bowls glazed in blue-green on my kitchen table. As for Derek and Linda, the marriage hadn't survived the failure of their plan. Linda filed for divorce in July. Their house went on the market. Derek moved into an apartment in Newington. Did I feel satisfaction? Briefly. Then just sadness, the sorrow of watching someone you love arrive at the consequences of their own choices. He called in August. "How are you, Mom?" "I'm well. How are you?" "Not great," he said. Kayla came in October, sat at my table, admired the bowls. Before she left, she hugged me, the kind that means something. The oak tree had gone golden. I stood on the porch and watched it. This is mine. This has always been mine. And I kept it. So that is my story. A house, a son, a fight I never wanted, and a victory I never expected to need. Here is what I learned. Your documents matter more than your assumptions. People who truly love you do not require access to your assets. And age is not incompetence, no matter how many people treat it that way. What would you have done in my place? I'd love to know. Leave a comment below. If this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening.